Chapter 21. The Later Wars and Conquests of Charles the Great 785–814 by Charles Oman. Wide scope of the later conquests of Charles, outlying provinces governed by his sons, conquest of the Baltic Slavs, subjection of Bohemia, wars with the Avars and their final subjection, hostilities with the Eastern Empire, conquest of the Spanish March, later revolts of the Saxons, wars with the Danes. King Charles had now come to the end of the first of the stages of his conquests, and the nearer enemies of the Frankish kingdom had been reduced to subjection. With comparatively little trouble, the fertile Lombard plain had been won. After long toil and exertion, the pathless woods and moors of Saxony had been taken within the boundary of his realm. But his schemes of conquest had a much wider scope than the annexation of Lombardy and Saxony. Before Christendom could be reckoned as safe from all foes without, there were more realms to be won, more marches to be made secure. By pushing his frontier up to the Elbe and the Julian Alps, Charles had taken up the ancient feuds of the Lombard and the Saxon with their eastern neighbors, the Avar and the Slav. Moreover, there was still the Spanish border to be made firm, for the expedition of 778 had resulted in no permanent gain. The unstable allegiance of Barcelona and Girona was once more being paid to the Umayyad king at Cordova, not to the lord of the Franks. The second period, therefore, in the record of the conquests of Charles the Great includes the history of the making firm of his new eastern and southwestern borders. But this is not, like the first 15 years of his reign, a time of complete conquest and incorporation of races who were near akin to the Franks. All the Teutonic peoples of Central Europe were already gathered beneath the scepter of Charles. The tribes with which he had now to do were strangers to the Franks, not only in religion, but in blood and language. Wide scope of Charles's schemes. The work of Charles in the East in the second period of his reign was to make the Slav and Avar harmless, by compelling their princes to pay homage and tribute, not by occupying their realms with Frankish garrisons or carving them up into countships and marches. In the West, on the other hand, his task was to build up a strong border against the Moor, by conquering, one by one, the fortresses between the Pyrenees and the Ebro. The Moslem had to be driven out, since there was no hope of converting him. In the towns from which he was expelled, a new population grew up, neither purely Spanish nor purely Frank, but the mixed race of the Catalans, in whose veins Romano-Spanish, Visigothic, Aquitanian, and Frankish blood was mingled in various proportions, so that they have always differed very considerably, both in character and in language, from the inhabitants of the rest of the peninsula. But the history of the foreign policy of Charles during the second period of his reign contains much more besides his dealings with the Slav, the Moor, and the Avar. He had frequent troubles with the East Roman Empire, arising from their disputed boundaries in Italy. In the very end of his reign, he met and turned off the first assault of the Danes on the Frankish realm, an attack insignificant in itself, but portending the gravest dangers in the future. We find him interfering beyond the British Sea with the affairs of Northumbria, and at the same time extending his hand far to the south to seize the Balearic Isles. Even to the distant Abbasid Caliph at Baghdad his fame was known, and Harun's ambassadors sought the court of Aachen to concert an alliance with him. In the second half of his reign, Charles very frequently took the field in person, but was not so constantly at the head of his armies as during the Perio 85. Charles makes his sons kings. He had now 3 growing sons, whom he entrusted with the charge of 3 important sections of his realm, and he looked to them to guard each that portion of the frontier of the Frankish Empire which bordered on his own sub-kingdom. Charles, the eldest of the 3, ruled in western Neustria, Anjou, Maine, Touraine, Pippin, the second, in Lombardy, Louis, the youngest, in Aquitaine. Charles would thus be specially concerned with the unruly Bretons of Armorica, who twice made unsuccessful risings in his father's reign, 786 and Louis was in charge of the Saracen frontier along the Pyrenees. Pippin had to keep watch over the Duke of Benevento, as well as to turn his attention to the Avars on the northeast of Italy. But the 3 princes were not strictly confined, each to his own sphere. Charles was occasionally sent against the Saxons. Louis conducted at least one campaign in southern Italy. Pippin more than once took charge of an attack on the Slavs of Bohemia. Whenever, in short, the great king could not march in person against a rebel or a foreign enemy, he would send one of his sons to take his place. He did not allow them to become completely localized and engrossed with the affairs of their respective governments, but often kept them with him at Aachen for many months at a time. In reviewing the later conquests of Charles the Great, it will be most convenient to follow the geographical order from north to south, rather than the chronological order of each campaign, for his arms were engaged in so many quarters at once that an attempt to tell his doings in a purely analytic form leads to dire confusion. On the northeast, the Frankish border, after 785, was fringed by Slavonic tribes, all ancient enemies of the Saxon conquest of the northern Slavs. These were the Abatrites in the north, in the modern Mecklenburg, the Wiltzes beyond them in western Pomerania, and the Sorbs in Brandenburg on the Havel and Spree. These tribes, like their kindred whom we have already met in the Balkan Peninsula, were rude peoples and not very formidable enemies, owing to their subdivisions under petty princes and their incapacity for union. Though numerous and not unwarlike, all the Slavs between Elbe and Oder were subdued by Charles in a single campaign. He crossed the Elbe in 789 with an Austrasian army, strengthened by levies of Frisians and of Saxons, who served gladly against their ancestral foes. The terror of his name seems to have stricken the Slavs with dismay. After a very slight resistance, first the Abatrites and their chief King Witzin, then the Wiltzes and their chief King Dragovit did homage to Charles, gave him as many hostages as he chose to demand, and consented to pay him a tribute and to receive the Christian missionaries whom he prepared to send among them. The Frankish army marched through moors and woods till it saw the Baltic at the mouth of the Peene in Pomerania, and then returned with some booty and no loss to the banks of the Rhine. So thoroughly were the Slavs subdued that during the next revolt of the Saxons, they did not take the opportunity of disowning their homage to Charles, but came to help him against the rebels, 795. Witzin, prince of the Abatrites, was actually slain by the Eastphalians while in arms for the Franks, and his death was well revenged by the king, who harried the lands along the Elbe with exceptional severity to atone for his allies' slaughter. In a later Saxon rising, 798, we again find the Abatrites taking arms at the bidding of Charles. Their new king Thrasyuko reconquered the Nordalbingians without Frankish aid and brought their chiefs in bonds to the king's feet, whereupon Charles honored him marvelously and gave the Slavs great gifts. Wars of Dane and Slav. 10 years later, the same prince and people fought valiantly against the Danes when they invaded the northern frontier of Charles's realm, though their neighbors the Wiltzes on this occasion deserted to the enemy. The latter people, however, were subdued again in 812, at the very end of the great king's reign, so that he left his eastern boundary undiminished at his death. On the whole, the Slavs of the north were not by any means the most difficult to rule of the many races with whom Charles had to deal. With their fellow Slavs more to the south, the Czechs of subjection of Bohemia, the Franks had comparatively few relations. The vast uninhabited tract of forest and mountain called the Burmerwald seems to have long kept them apart. But in 805-6, the king sent against them his son and namesake Charles the Younger, who twice wasted all the valley of the upper Elbe, and finally compelled the chiefs of the Czechs to acknowledge their dependence on the Frankish Empire by paying tribute. South of Bohemia, along the Danube and the Raab and Leith, the realms of Charles bordered on the Tartar tribe of the Avars, ancient enemies both of the Lombards and of the emperors of Constantinople. The Avars had of late years fallen on evil times, war with the Avars. They were vexed with civil wars so much that none of their princes any longer ruled the whole race, or could call himself by the title of Chagan, the old name of their supreme ruler. Yet, though wasted by their own dissensions, and by the revolts of the Slavonic tribes who were their vassals, the Avars could not keep from their old habit of making descents on their neighbors. They drew down their doom on themselves by invading, in 788, at once the Lombard March of Friuli and the vassal Duchy of Bavaria. When next he had leisure, 2 years later, Charles planned an invasion of their land on the largest scale. He himself marched down the Danube with an Austrasian and Saxon army, burst through the long line of fortifications with which the Avars had strengthened their border, and wasted their lands as far as the Rab. At the same moment, a great Lombard host entered the valley of the Drave, pushed into the heart of Pannonia, beat the Avars in the field, and stormed their great circular camps. The complete subjection of the whole tribe would have followed in the next year if Charles had not been called away by a Saxon revolt, which kept him employed during the two next campaigning seasons. The king himself never again took the field against the Avars, but his son Pippin and Eric, Duke of Friuli, continued the war on his behalf. Twice they captured the great ring, or royal camp, between Danube and Theus, the central stronghold of the Avar race, and sent its spoils to Aachen in such quantities that Charles was able to send Avaric trophies as gifts to all his friends, even to such distant kings as Offa of Mercia. The Avars subdued. At last the spirit of the Avars was so much broken that their chiefs, or Teutons, came of their own accord to Aachen to do homage to Charles and offered to receive Christianity. Their submission was accepted. The king appointed one of them to rule the whole race as his vassal, and bade him assume the ancient title of Chagan, 805. This prince was baptized by the name of Abraham, paid a regular tribute to the Franks, and kept his subjects for the future from the dangerous temptation of meddling with the Lombard or Bavarian border. The Avars were, however, in a state of decay at this time, and their race and kingdom were ere long to be swept away by the invading Magyars. The same fate which befell the Tartar Avars fell also upon their southern neighbors and former vassals, the Slavs of the Save and Drave. These Carantanians, Corinthians, and Slovenians were subdued by the arms of Charles's Bavarian and Lombard subjects, and became dependents of the Frankish Empire, forced to pay tribute and do homage, but not wholly incorporated with the realm. We have already spoken in a previous chapter of the dealings of Charles with Italy. He never succeeded in fully subduing the Duchy of Benevento, though its dukes were several times compelled to do him homage when he marched in person against them. Italy was finally put under charge of Pippin, the king's second son, who was given the royal title and authority there as his father's delegate. Pippin, besides the task of striving to hold down Benevento, had also to cope with the intrigues of the Eastromans in Italy. The Constantinopolitan emperor had still a foothold in the peninsula at Naples, Reggio, and Brindisi, and still enjoyed the homage of the half-independent peoples of Venice and Istria. Luckily for the Franks, the Eastern realm was during the most important years of Charles's reign, under the weak hands of the Empress Irene, 780-90 and 802, and the usurper Nicephorus, I 800-11. They bitterly resented the establishment of a new power in Italy and the assumption of the imperial title by the Frankish king, which they regarded as the worst insult that could be put upon the majesty of the Eastern Empire, which claimed to be the sole and legitimate heir of Augustus and Constantine. Wars with the Eastromans. But their efforts went little further than endeavoring to stir up trouble in Italy by means of the Lombard Prince Adelchis, the son of King Desiderius, who had fled to Constantinople and become a Byzantine patrician. He tried to make more than one descent on Italy, but met with uniform ill success. The only serious fighting between Frank and Eastroman was in the years 804-10, when Nicephorus I undertook several expeditions against Italy to avenge the revolt of Venice. In the first-named year, a party among the Venetians, who were torn by civil strife, called in the Franks and transferred their allegiance to Charles. Nicephorus sent out a fleet which harried the coasts of Tuscany and the Exarchate, but could make no solid impression on the Lombard kingdom. A little later, the Eastroman party in Venice got the upper hand and once more handed the city over to the Byzantines. Contented with the recovery of his vassal state, Nicephorus then made peace with Charles. The only net result of the war had been that the Franks got permanent possession of Pola and the other coast cities of Istria, which had hitherto been Eastroman. Michael Rangabe, the successor of Nicephorus, went so far in allying himself with Charles that he consented to recognize him as Emperor of the West, a concession accepted with pride by the Franks and regarded as a lamentable token of weakness by the Constantinopolitans, 812. One of the consequences of the conquests of Charles in Italy was to bring the Franks into collision with the Saracen pirates, who infested the central Mediterranean, making their harborage in the ports of the islands which face the western coast of the peninsula. Wars with Saracen pirates. At a date which cannot be accurately fixed, the Franks took possession of Corsica and Sardinia, hunting out the Saracen colonists who had conquered the islands from the East Romans some 50 or 60 years before. In 799, the Franks also took possession of the Balearic Islands. These distant dependencies were attacked and ravaged by fleets from Spain on more than one occasion, but they were held down to the close of the reign of Charles. They were given in charge to the Counts of Genoa and Tuscany, who seem to have been able to raise a considerable fleet and more than once gained naval victories over the plundering Moor. But the most serious struggle between Charles and the Moslems took place in Spain, where during the whole of the second period of his reign, the fighting was almost continuous. The permanent advance of the Christians beyond the Pyrenees began with the capture of Gerona in 785. The conduct of the war fell mainly into the hands of Louis, the third son of Charles, whom his father had named King of Aquitaine and trusted with all the affairs of the southwest. He and his chief captain and counselor William, Count of Toulouse, a great hero in the Frankish romances, had to deal with the two first Umayyad kings of Cordova, Abdurrahman, 755–88, and Hisham, 780–897, both strong and capable rulers from whom it was by no means easy to win territory. Conquests in Spain. Nevertheless, the Christian border slowly advanced, owing to the seditious and turbulent Moslem governors, who were always rebelling against their masters and calling in Frankish aid. In 795, the newly won land beyond the Pyrenees, around the towns of Gerona, Cardona, Urgel, and Osona, was made into a separate government, the March of Spain, and entrusted to a margrave of its own, instead of forming a dependency of the Duchy of Septimania. Barcelona, the greatest town of Catalonia, was added to the March in 797 by the treachery of its governor Zaid, who, failing in a rebellion against his master at Cordova, handed the place over to the Franks. The Moors recovered it for a moment in 799, but King Louis then came over the Pyrenees with the whole levy of Aquitaine and laid siege to the town. It held out for nearly 2 years, but fell in 801, conquered by famine, after the Franks had walled it in with a circumvallation, and sat before it in their huts for the whole winter of 808–1. The Moorish population departed en masse after the surrender, and the great city was repopulated with Goths from Septimania. The Franks were now firmly established beyond the Pyrenees, and in the last 10 years of Charles's reign subdued the whole southern slope of the mountains from Pampeluna as far as the mouth of the Ebro. Tarragona, the second town of Catalonia, fell in 809, and Tortosa, the great fortress which commanded the lower course of the Ebro, in 811. After this, the Franks were able to cross the river and ravage the wide plains of Valencia. It was probably their advance in this direction that induced Al-Hakam, the third Umayyad ruler of Cordova, to sue for peace in 812, ceding to the Christians all that they had gained beyond the Pyrenees. The Franks were not destined to hold permanently the entirety of their conquests, but Barcelona and all the towns north of it were lost to Islam and won for Christendom. These strongholds guarded the Aquitanian frontier against Saracen inroads with success, and were ultimately to form the nucleus of the more important half of the Christian kingdom of Aragon. Such were the foreign conquests of Charles the Great, but his offensive campaigns were not the only wars in which blood was shed during the later years of his reign. There were also troubles, though of comparatively insignificant scope, within the interior of his realm. We have already alluded to 2 fruitless attempts of the Bretons of Armorica to resume their ancient independence. These were easily crushed, but not so the later Saxon rebellions, later Saxon revolts. It was 7 years after the pacification of 785 before the unruly dwellers by the Elbe and Weser rose again. But in the 8th summer, some of the districts of the extreme north took arms again and relapsed into their ancestral heathendom, returning like the dog to his vomit. The words of the contemporary chronicler. The insurrection spread widely among the Eastphalians and Nordalbingians in the following year, 793, and was not finally put down, though it never extended over the whole land, as did the great risings of the early part of the reign of Charles. Ere 2 years more were passed, there were new troubles among the Ingrians and Nordalbingians, which required the presence of Charles. But it says much for the growing strength of his power in the country that he was able to suppress them by means of armies composed partly of Christian Saxons and partly of the loyal Slavs of the Abatrite tribe. The last outbreak in the land was as late as 804. It extended only over the northern tribes and was suppressed by the summary transportation to Gaul of the whole of the unruly Nordalbingian race, the greatest offenders among the rebels. Charles settled 0 of their families in small colonies among the Neustrians and gave their vacant lands as a gift to his vassal, the king of the Abatrites. This was the last Saxon rebellion. Henceforth, they abandoned the worship of evil spirits and gave up the wicked customs of their fathers and received the sacrament of Christian baptism, mingling with the Franks till at last they were reckoned one race with them. Complete subjection of Saxony. The complete subjection and conversion of Saxony is marked by the creation of the first bishoprics in the country at this period. Charles established bishops at Bremen, Münster, and Paderborn in 846 to serve respectively as the religious centers of northern, western, and southern Saxony. Others were afterwards added at Hamburg, Osnabrück, Verden, Hildesheim, Minden, and Magdeburg, but these foundations belong to the next generation. Round these bishops' sees grew up the first towns of Saxony, for hitherto its inhabitants had lived a purely rural life and never gathered within walls. The possession of Saxony brought Charles in the end of his reign into hostile contact with a race almost unknown to his ancestors, but destined to be only too well known to his sons, the Danes of the Jutland Peninsula and the Scandinavian Isles, who dwelt beyond the Eider on the Nordalbingian border. The advent of a new and militant Christian power into the recesses of the unknown north seems to have stirred up the Danes to unwanted activity. They must have heard from Widukind and the other Saxon exiles who took refuge with them many tales of the untiring energy and unrelenting severity of the great king of the Franks, and feared lest his strong hand would be stretched out beyond the Eider to add them to the list of his tributaries and force them to accept his religion. Wars with the Danes. To guard against the further advance of the Franks, King Godfred built in 808 all along his frontier, at the narrowest point of the Isthmus of Schleswig, a great earthwork from sea to sea, long known as the Danewerk, and famed in wars down to the last conflict of German and Dane in 1863. But Godfred did not confine himself to defensive works. He began to make piratical descents all along the Frisian and Flemish coasts as far as the mouth of the Seine, and at the same time attacked the Abatrites and Wiltzes, the Slavonic vassals of Charles, on the Baltic. Godfred did much damage in Frisia and actually succeeded for a moment in crushing the Abatrites and subduing the Wiltzes. He gave the Franks much trouble since he ravaged all the coast where it was unguarded, but took to his ships again when a large army was sent against him. In 810, he penetrated so far into Frisia that he spoke, in boasting mood, of paying Charles a visit at Aachen. But in the same year he was murdered by his own people, and his nephew and successor Hemming made peace with the Franks. The peace was ill-kept, for we hear of isolated Danish raids in the last years of Charles's reign and a fleet of warships, which were built in the ports of Neustria for the defense of the coast, does not seem to have protected the Frisian waters very efficiently. But Charles did not survive to see the serious development of the Danish attack. He died before his realm had suffered any serious loss from their ravages, and must have been far from suspecting that ere he was 50 years dead, these half-known and somewhat despised foes would pierce through the Frankish Empire from end to end, and even sack his own chosen dwelling, the royal palace of Aachen.